Welcome. My name is Thomas Bespel. I am the resident writing consultant here at the Copenhagen Business School Library. This is the Craft of Research series, and today we're going to talk about how to write the background section of a research project. One of the things I've been stressing throughout all of these talks is that the structure that I suggest, the outline that I suggest, the table of contents, if you will, that I suggest, which has been outlined in a previous talk. Was that last week, I think, or the week before that? We talked about how to structure. But that outline is not a rule for how every research paper is done. And so you end up modifying it. You use some of the little tricks that I present there as far as how to think about structure in order to plan out your particular project. And that goes for every section as well. So I'm going to tell you some general things you can think about when thinking about the background section. You can decide whether or not you even want to have a background section or whether it's part of some other section. One place that the background section sometimes goes, which would be different from what I normally suggest, is in the method section, when it becomes part of your argument for your case choice. Right? So you're making decisions about your case, and so part of the description of the case, the sort of the background description of that case may be a methodological choice, right? That may be part of you chose this company because it fits your research question, and so it becomes part of your methodology, right? But I'm not going to present it that way today. Today I'm going to present it as a separate section that usually comes right after the introduction, right? But I really, really stress this. Please appropriate this in your own way, make use of it in a way that makes sense to you, and only ever let my suggestions help you. If they make your work harder or less pleasant, or if they in some way diminish your hopes as far as doing it, then don't listen to me. Right? That's not what I'm here for. I'm just here to give you some things that might help you get a handle on the problems that you're facing. All right. Our standard trick with all of the sections has been to draw a line on a piece of paper. The idea behind this is to make sure we get a little bit of structure just kind of imposed as soon as we take a blank problem and we structure it. We say there's one part and another part. Then we immediately calm down. And of course, you'll know that you'll recognize this from my suggestion about how to write paragraphs. Always make a decision the day before about what you're going to write, and then the next morning write the paragraph. And now you've got a nice way of controlling your process from day to day. So really keep that in mind, that that's the basic kind of calmness that we're looking for. But that's not how I'm going to use this line today, and I haven't been for all the sections. We're just going to always ask, what is the basis on which I'm writing the section, and what is the purpose? To what end am I writing it? For the Danes in the audience, hvad jeg ude på, og hvad har jeg her i, right? Nice two-step procedure there. Decide what is your foundation, where, what gives you the materials or the authority to speak, and what are you trying to do with that information, right? What are you trying to do? Today we're going to talk about the background section. So we'll just call, and again, this is merely a guide. I would call it the background section. You may call it something else. You may call it context, right? There's lots of different things you can call it. But give it a name of some kind, and you may even say that you might be more poetic and call it like the name of the company. Or if you were writing about the CIA, you might call it the Center of Intelligence or something like that, which is their own slogan, right? So you may decide to be a little poetic about it, right? Does that make sense? So just, that's entirely up to you. Let's then talk about the basis on which you would write it. The way you know that you're writing the background section and not some other section of your paper is that you're going to base it on publicly available documents. So we're going to call this documents of some kind, and that's a word I'm using because it's quite broad, and you'll see that there's lots of things that could go into that. And we're going to say there's got to be two basic general principles we want to have with these. We want to make sure they are publicly available, and we want to make sure they are citable. I'll say a little bit about those two things. But what makes them distinct as documents from some other sources that you're using is your theory section will be based on the literature, right? The scientific literature that you've done a review of, that's in the academic journals and the books, sometimes in your required reading. And that is, in a certain sense, publicly available, but that's actually become increasingly controversial because it's very often behind some rather expensive paywalls that your library makes available to you, right? Certainly there's a lot of journalism behind paywalls as well. But I think it's nothing like the cost that we're talking about when we talk about academic journals. And so, it's these, we would say these are available to specialists. These are available to academics, to researchers. And once you are a researcher or you are a student at a world-class research institution like the Copenhagen Business School, then you have access to them. But we wouldn't say it's an ordinary public kind of access, right? So that's one of the things you want to make sure that these documents are publicly available, and that's one sense in which they're distinct. And then they're going to be citable, and that's very much like your scientific literature, which is to say you can put brackets behind a claim or a quote or something like that. You can put a name of the author of the document, a date, and then that refers the reader to the literature list. And so the documents here will appear in your list of literature at the end of the research project, right? In general, and you always have to ask your supervisors about this, but most supervisors in most of our programs will agree with me that you don't want to make you don't want to do a literature list with categories like newspapers, journal articles, books, right? Because all that means is that the reader has to consult 3 different literature lists to find out what Jones 2017 meant, right? You want one alphabetical list at the end of your document. So it's not going to be separated out like that in your literature list. So these documents are going to be citable in the normal way, right? You'll just gesture at your literature list, and once the reader goes to your list of literature at the end of your paper, they will be able to find the document using the instructions you provide there, right? Either there'll be a web address, there might be a newspaper title, or there may be a book title or whatever, and the reader will be able to go to that document, to that source, right? So that's very important about these documents. What does that rule out? Well, first of all, it rules out your data, right? So there's going to be a lot of things that you know about your company. You're studying the case you're studying, for example, or the companies or the situation, the market, that you know because you've gathered data. So you have the primary data, and so you know these things. The things that you would need to cite your data for don't go in the background section. Right, so that's one way to keep it straight. If you are going to be referring to your data to support the claim, it probably doesn't go in the background section. There may be exceptions to this, but I would, even in cases where you know it because somebody in the interview told it to you, I will strongly recommend that you verify that claim that the interview subject gave you, right, with some publicly available document like the annual report of the same company. So if you're interviewing the CFO of a company, that he says something about the financial health of the company, right, then you go to the annual report in order to cite the claim that he's making. Does that make sense? So you know you're working on a background if you're not using your data. That's one set of sources you're not going to be using. And then there's a body of gray matter there, or gray sources, gray literature, which is a lot of you will be studying context situations where the documents that inform you about that context are internal to the organization. So you'll have access to some internal memos. Maybe you'll just be on an email list within the company or whatever, right? The problem with those is that they are citable when they are as personal communication or unpublished manuscripts or things like this, internal communication, which means you aren't in a position to say to the reader, you just go here and then you can find it, you can check for yourself, right? So those kinds of sources I would also encourage you not to use in the background section for reasons I will talk about in a bit, but just try to keep that, like, if you're going to use them, see if you can't find some other way of doing it. Right? If you must, then remember that it's a weaker source for the kinds of things you want to be doing in the background section. Right? Yeah, so there's those two things. And then, of course, what we just very quickly want to do is say this is not the analysis, right? Because analysis is based on data. So it's not that, right? And it's not the discussion section either. We could distinguish this with lots. And remember, the discussion section, we'll get to this, I believe, next week. Yeah, we'll get to this next week, right? Discussion. I don't know. At some point, we're going to talk about discussion based on reason. Reason and nothing else, really. No new sources. So it's going to be reasoning about the things you've already said. And the reason I'm mentioning these two specific contrast sections is that they're going to be important for finding out what the background can be used for. Right? The background will be very useful to think about. You need to put some things in the background in order to make things in the analysis and the discussion possible, right? In order to set you up to accomplish things in later sections. And that's why it's good to have those in mind. And if you are doing a lot of common sense reasoning, you're not writing the background section. If what you're saying is, if you're describing the empirical background, those kind of the background conditions of your case or whatever, in ways that are just kind of intuitive, like everybody kind of knows this sort of stuff, and this is just sort of how one would obviously go about doing things, right? Then you're not writing the background section either, right? Or you are probably not contributing those sentences usefully to the background section because they're not doing the work they need to do. If you're reasoning, thinking, if you're sort of, if you're discussing with the reader, right? If you're drawing out implications, if you're thinking, right? Then you're in the discussion. That's the idea. But that's not what you're doing in the background section. In the background section, you're basically just relating facts. And a distinction I made, I believe, in the analysis, when we're talking about the analysis, that I want to emphasize again today, because it bears on the background section, is keep in mind that there's a subtle and not particularly rigorous philosophical distinction between factual and empirical. Right? And we think empirical facts, that's just all the facts are empirical, and in a certain sense, that's true. But remember that there are some facts that are just facts that you can quote various sources for, and then there are facts that you have established by your own empirical research. So facts in a sense that you have constructed empirically out of data, right? Those facts are those are empirical facts versus mere factual facts, just ordinary facts. Facts that are just lying around ready for you to just tell the reader that they're true, right? And you want to confine yourself in the background section to that kind of fact. right? We could even call them journalistic facts or historical facts, that kind of thing, right? Not data-based statements of fact, right? So those are kinds of the distinctions you want to keep in mind. Got the black one, that's good. All right, so now let's talk about the purpose of the background section. What are we trying to do? Keep in mind here that the reader, your reader, is a peer. So a fellow student in your cohort that you have an enormous amount of respect for. It's somebody who is as knowledgeable as you, not on your particular subject, like not on the thing you've studied, right? But is as knowledgeable as you, certainly about the literature, right? Has as good a grasp of the sort of methodologies you've been using. So if you've done interviews, your reader's good at doing interviews, right? That means your reader has a way of reading your methods section in a critical way. One way I like to say this is, you respect your reader enough to think of your reader as somebody who's qualified to tell you that you're wrong, right? Just give your reader that cred, right? Say, if I say something that isn't true, that isn't correct, and my reader thinks so, right? I'm not going to say, well, who are you to say I'm wrong? I'm going to say, oh, you're exactly the person that gets to tell me I'm wrong if I am, right? That's the reader you're writing for. And so as not to make that reader too scary, don't think of it as your teacher or your examiner. Think of your reader always as a peer, somebody in your cohort, preferably somebody you could call up, somebody you could give a few pages of your project to and have them read it, give you some feedback, that kind of thing, right? Somebody who's available to you, whose mind is open to yours. If you think about the reader in that way, you have a good way of thinking about the purpose of all sections, of course, but also the background section, because now that we've given the reader all this competence, all this knowledge that you share, right, all this respect, right, you're seeing the reader as yourself. You have to decide what are the things that the reader needs to know from you in order to make sense of the project or the paper that you're writing. Right? So what are the things that you can reasonably say to your reader? You, dear reader, are ignorant. I'm assuming that you are ignorant about these things, right? That's in the background section. That is a legitimate place to construe your reader as ignorant of the facts you're about to present to them. That's not how you want to talk to the reader in the theory section, right? Because there you want to talk to the reader as though the reader is familiar with the same literature. And that means that your purpose is to inform an ignorant reader. Information, right? And we're going to just put in brackets here, your reader doesn't know. There's a qualification to that. Because sometimes your reader will know, right? But you're going to write this in such a way that it is helpful to the reader that doesn't know it. So you're going to write it in an informative, matter-of-fact, helpful kind of tone of voice. You don't want to be condescending, of course, right? You don't want to talk down to the reader, but you do want to treat the reader as somebody who needs this information, right? And again, that's where it's different from the other, like for example, the theory section, right? The literature. People have a tendency to write their literature reviews in the tone of a background section, which is awful for the reader to read, because now the reader has to read about a bunch of literature that they're familiar with as though they're being told about it for the first time, right? Which is boring. We don't want to do that. But in the case of the background section, it's totally fair. You've studied a company. The reader, though they're familiar with your theory, are not familiar with that company. Everything you tell them will be brilliant news to them, right? So it may be very familiar to you, and you may be saying, "Oh, I'm being, this is trivial," right? But just you're choosing things that you want the reader to know, and that's where we can begin to gesture these two sections here. Right? Because how do you choose, of all the things that you want to say to the reader, which things you want to tell the reader? Yeah, you have a question?
You say that information about the relevance of the paper belongs in the introduction or in the meta?
That's a really good question. So information about the relevance of the case or of your study in general.
Just for the study.
Yeah. Mainly that kind of motivating writing is going to go into the introduction. But it could go in the background section if you think that you need a long argument for that and you don't feel you have room for it in the introduction. I would then say that there's two, you have to divide that up, because maybe part of the argument is the relevance of the theory, in which case those paragraphs will go in the theory section. Maybe some of it is the relevance of this kind of case, this sort of topic thing, right? So that would go in the background section. I think I mentioned this in the first talk when I talked about the nature of paragraphs, right? Paragraphs are usually statements. They have key sentences that state things that are true, and then your rhetorical posture, paragraph for paragraph, is going to be either to support, elaborate, or defend, right? To get your reader, help your reader believe it, help your reader understand it, or help your reader agree with you, right? So your reader may have the opposite opinion, and you have to defend yourself, right? And then I said there's a fourth difficulty, right? Which is your reader doesn't have any trouble believing you, doesn't have any trouble understanding you, and agrees with you. And so the difficulty here is that the reader is bored with what you have to say, right? And you have the problem that you're really excited about it, and the reader is really bored with it. So now you have to establish the relevance of it. Why do we need to know this? And you may run into that every once in a while in the background section and in the theory section. It's natural to put it in your very first paragraph, first few paragraphs of the introduction, right? To have that kind of, here's why this is exciting, that kind of writing. But you want to keep it rare because, again, remember your reader is a peer who mostly is interested in the same things as you. And being interested in the same things as you and dealing with the same things will understand the relevance. Like the relevance will seem natural, important to them, right? So you shouldn't spend too many of your paragraphs doing that, right? But it's not, it wouldn't be wrong to say to decide, okay, I'm now running into this problem in the background section or even in the theory section. It wouldn't be, I wouldn't say it's a mistake. It's just you want to notice how often you're doing it, because if you're really very often defending the relevance of your work, then you're maybe imagining the wrong reader, right? And it's just a matter of shifting your mindset to another reader where it's more natural that they would be reading this kind of thing. Yep. So there's kind of two ways you can decide on this information. The first is, obviously, you're going to be doing an analysis of your empirical object about which you've gathered data. So let's say you've done interviews with people in an organization. They will be talking about the kinds of things they do, right? They'll obviously be talking about the products they make. They'll be talking about the bosses they have. They'll be talking about the pay they make, the food they eat in the cafeteria, whatever it is you've studied, right? In order to understand statements like that, when you quote them or paraphrase them, the reader will have to know what some of those words mean, right? Like they say, I went into this building. You're studying at university, and I went into Kiel, right? Okay, well, maybe if a lot of people are talking about their relationship to that building, then you're going to have to explain to the reader, who you can't presume is familiar with the campus, right? Because it could be anything, it could be any organization. You're going to have to explain what that building is, what happens there, right? Depending on what they're saying about it, depending on what the people are using their references to those buildings for, right? You may need to explain to them how the elevators work, or how right? So you know what they're saying in your interviews, and in the background section, you're going to make sure the reader is properly informed to make sense of those things. If your interview subjects are talking about the culture shock of two teams merging, or even two companies merging, right? Then you will probably have to explain the history of that merger, right? You'll have to say, well, there was a merger, right? so that the reader understands what these people are saying when you get to that part in your analysis. But notice you're not saying that based on the data, you're saying that based on other kinds of sources. So that's one of the definite things you want to keep in mind, that the information here is going to be used in your analysis to make sense of what the people are doing there, right? You're explaining acronyms as well, right? Or the history of the company in terms of there were some good years and there were some bad years, right? And so the people are talking about the good years and the bad years, right? So you need to make sure that all of that, whatever it is that is needed, is made available in the background section. And then you get to the discussion. And of course, if you've done the analysis roughly the way I suggest, there's been some interesting tension between the theoretical framing and the analysis. The reader's views have been challenged a little bit. There's been something there that needs to be resolved. So there's the question of what follows from this, what are the consequences, and that's of course what the discussion is for. It traces out the implications. Right here. We can even we'll write this in here. This is the sort of the soft way of saying it, that the analysis will usually challenge the theory in some way, and that will have some implications, right? Now, if it has implications for theory, then you want to make sure that the theory section has set up the theoretical model that the analysis will then challenge, and then the implications will suggest modifications to the theory. But that's not how all papers work. Sometimes you're going to suggest modifications to practice, right? You're going to say, we've analyzed this company, we have this theory. The theory would suggest a more efficient way of doing it, right? So we've got a theory that says this is how we would normally do it. The analysis shows they're deviating from that. The implications are bring the practice into line with the theory, which means we're going to have to fire somebody, or we're going to have to change a policy, or we're going to have to reorganize a team or a division in the company or something like that, right? So we're going to make some kind of proposal. We sometimes call this managerial implications or recommendations for practice. In order for the reader to make sense of those recommendations, they're going to have to know something about the company or the context in which that you're operating, right? So keep that in mind, that that information needs to be provided to the reader in the background section. Right? Does that make sense? So it's really those are the two things you really want to keep in mind. What am I doing in the analysis, and what am I going to be doing in the discussion that the reader needs background information to understand, right? To make sense of, so that it will naturally fit there. What is the situation in the world that I'm going to propose changes to? So I'm going to need to make sure that that information is made available to the readers. Right. Are there any questions so far to that? Does that seem pretty straightforward? That's because then I thought I'd just sort of talk a little bit about why this can be a really fun section to write and what sorts of things you could write about, right? One of the things to keep in mind is that it should be a little bit fun, because it's relatively easy intellectually to write the background section. All you have to do is know some facts about the company or the country or the market or the product, right, or region that you are studying, that you're interested in. And of course, since you are interested in it, it's a joy in its own right to gather information about it. If you are studying a particular company, I really encourage you to take a walk around that company as much as you can, right, to get a feel for it. Now, you're not going to do a lot of literary description of that feel, right? You may, it depends on the kind of analysis you're doing. I mean, maybe you're doing a cultural analysis, and a background description of what the buildings are like and so forth might be useful. Separate from your fieldwork descriptions, right? But there may be some sort of kind of journalistic scene setting that will be good. But no matter what happens, it's just the fact that you have a feeling about it, that you have a kind of a corporeal, a sensory memory, right, of being in this place, that it is a real place, will show through your writing. Remember what Hemingway says, 7/8 of the of your knowledge remains below the surface. Only 1/8 gets to the surface. All the details you know about the company, but don't tell the reader, will increase your dignity, right? That will contribute to the dignity of movement of your text. So really keep that in mind. Learn really a great deal, and then pick the things that are going to be necessary for the reader to know to get the analysis and the discussion, but learn much more. So you're writing from this almost like an omniscience. You're like a narrator of a novel, and you're making it all up, right? You have all the information, right? So I really suggest you do that. Get some real life experience with the organization or whatever. If you're studying a product, make sure you go, at least, maybe you can't afford to buy it, but go, at least go to the store and look at it or something, right? Make sure you get a tangible, tactile sense of this thing. That the fact that you actually have a concrete experience with the thing you're describing will show in your writing, right? And then enjoy that kind of literary description. The best way to enjoy writing is to give yourself the time you need to do it. So again, every paragraph, give yourself about 27 minutes. Give yourself exactly 27 minutes would be a good idea. Take a 3-minute break afterwards. Spend those 27 minutes writing at least 6 sentences and at most 200 words that says one thing and supports, elaborates, or defends. In the case of the background section, you'll often be elaborating, right? The problem is not really going to be getting the reader to believe your account. You're trying to get your reader to understand what these facts mean, right? In some cases, though, you do want to make sure that the reader also feels like, oh yeah, now I believe this, right? I believe that the company had a good year. I believe this product works. I believe it does this, not this other. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Just first of all, give yourself the conditions you need to enjoy the actual writing, and give yourself the materials you need, the experience you need, the background you need, the documents that you need, so that you also feel confident. Like, you should feel like an authority on the subject. And I think this is one of the things that I think too often in social science forget, is you come out of this, writing a research project like this, not just more theoretically precise, not just with some empirical conclusion that you now very much know is true. You come out of this as a kind of authority or expert on the company or product or market or issue that you've studied, right? You come out just knowledgeable, right? Like somebody who is more interesting to talk to about these things than somebody who hasn't done this kind of project, right? And so really just make that effort, find some good books on the subject, read those books in a leisurely way, right? Be interested in the newspaper coverage, read The Economist about it, read The New Yorker if there is something about in The New Yorker there, because that's very, very good writing in those outlets. So you get kind of a sense for this, that you have this base of information. So inform yourself so you feel like an authority, enjoy that authority, and give yourself the time you need to really work on your sentences. What you want to make sure is that the reader can basically see this background, right? And they should be able to see a background against which the object can kind of stand out. So you're describing a background, maybe a whole organization or an entire industry, right? And then the particular team of people that you've studied will emerge on that background, and you'll have given them a backdrop, like a stage set, and then you can describe what's actually happening in front of them. But you've given them a nice realistic background to act against. So enjoy that literary part. Half an hour at a time, paragraph after paragraph. And once you've decided how big your background section is going to be 5 paragraphs or 10 paragraphs or whatever, you've also kind of decided how long you're going to give yourself to write every version of it, right? Because you can then assign ½ hour per paragraph, maybe say, I'm going to write every paragraph 3 times, right? and then I will kind of get a sense of how many hours I'm going to spend writing this stuff. Once you've done that, it becomes much easier just to appreciate it, right? To play with it, to get a feel for the language. I've said about the methods section that it's a great place to work on your voice, because you get to tell your story. You get to say what you did and why you did it, right? You're really just explaining your thinking about how you gathered your data. This isn't exactly like that, but it is experience-based in the sense that this is what you have learned about the organization, and you're just going to talk about it like somebody who's learned, right? You're not going to be worried about, is your data good enough or is your method strong enough, because you're just stating facts that are publicly available, right? So it's a really good writing exercise for that. Decide what your focus is. Are you describing mainly a group of people? So do we need to know their names, their position, their roles, their functions in the organization? So is the important thing about the background that these are people doing particular kinds of things? Do we need to know their names? If not, do we need to know do you need to make up names for them, right? If we need to hide their names, do we need to make up interesting names that we can use? Also, when we get to the analysis, right? That sort of thing. So decide that that's one of the things. And if you're going to be describing people, remember to think of this in terms of kind of portraits, right? You're going to be a portrait writer, right? You'll be writing portraits of people. Or is this more like a place, right? Is this more important that this is a setting, and what you're offering is more like a guidebook to this place, right? If you were going to go here, how would you get there? Once you get there, what would you do there, right? How would you get around here, right? Are you going to describe this as a place, right? We could use a map metaphor there, but because it's writing, I don't want you to get thinking too much about pictures of things like that, right? But so think of more like a guide book, right? Writing about the place, letting the reader orient themselves in that place. Of course, another really, really straightforward way of writing a background section is to say, this is a series of events, right? So these are things that happened. I'm basically writing a history, right? Or I'm writing a newspaper story or something that feels a little bit like a magazine, maybe more like a magazine story, right? I'm writing a story, right? At that point, I always, whenever somebody talks to me about storytelling, I always say, remember again, Hemingway's wonderful way of thinking about stories as a sequence of fact and motion. So whenever, and you can do this quite generally for the entire paper, but certainly it'll work in the background section, is whenever you think of a paragraph, ask yourself, is this describing a fact, a state of affairs, a certain way things are, or is it describing a set of actions or changes to the way things are? So is it a static situation or a dynamic process, right? Paragraph for paragraph, and then give the reader a bit of variation, right? So it's some places maybe and some people doing things in those places, right? That kind of thing. A natural thing also to describe, of course, is the organization itself, and then remember to think sort of in terms of Mintzberg's diagrams and stuff like that, right? Like we can schematically distinguish types of organizations from each other, right? And so make sure that, is this a very hierarchical organization? Am I going to describe this as it has an apex and there's, you know, subdivisions and all kinds of stuff, and this is how I'm going to describe it? Or is it a very flat organization? And so I'm going to make sure that the reader gets that sense of a very flat organization, right? And then another thing that you get background sections doing, and of course, I'm not saying they have to do any one of these things, they could do several things, you decide, and this will especially be true if the implications are like the one that I always talk about with economists, right? So if economists discover that a market is inefficient because it's over-regulated, right, then the implication of that is deregulate that market, right? Which is a policy change, it's a political change, right? It's a change in the law. sometimes just a change in the tax code. Well, that means that we're going to have to describe that policy environment, right? So we're going to say there are a set of policies that govern this area. It could be EU policy, it could be national laws, but we're going to describe those policies because the kicker in our discussion is going to be that we're going to propose a change to that law. And of course, the radical version of this is we're going to say capitalism is broken. It's time for a revolution. Well, if you're going to say that, then we need a background section that describes capitalism or late capitalism, right, in its most decadent phase, whatever it is that your Marxist beliefs tell you to do, right? And that's like a very legitimate background section. I'd say we live in late capitalism. This is what it's like. This is how oppressed we are, right? So now when we get to the implications, when I say we should do this and this and this to fight the power, it makes sense, right? Good. Yes. So I already stressed this. I'll just stress it again, and then I'll let you go, and we'll take a break. Is have fun with this section, right? It is cognitively relatively easy. You are talking to a reader that you are assuming doesn't know these things. And I do want to make this, so enjoy that relationship, right? Enjoy that position of superiority that you have. But remember that you are also writing something that some people who read it will know. Right? So there are some of your readers who will have just as good an understanding of that company or that product or that market or that historical period or whatever it is that you're describing in the background section. And you just want to make sure that some of your readers will skip it for that reason, right? They'll say, oh, I know all this stuff, I don't need it, right? And some of your readers will read it to find out if you are telling this story the way they would tell it, right? Are you as knowledgeable as they are about it? So don't get arrogant. Make sure that you are humble with this process, even though that you are constructing yourself as the knowledgeable person and your reader as the ignorant one, right? So there's a humility in that that's worth really just practicing in your writing, right? Good. Background section. It's I think this was the least popular one as far as signups go. I was also kind of thinking, is this the most boring one? But I think that went really nicely. I think that I tried to make it interesting for you. We'll take a 5-minute break, and then I'll take whatever questions you have for as long as you like.